Today on Mr. Media, I'll talk to Howard Sounes, author of an extensive and intensive new biography of Beatle Paul McCartney, Fab, An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney. Stick around. Baby, you'll be amazed.
Hey, did you know that you can listen to the latest Mr. Media on your phone with the Stitcher app? Stitcher is smart radio for your smartphone. Mr. Media is on demand and on the go with Stitcher. Download Stitcher for your phone today. Get the free download at Stitcher.com. That's STITCHER.com.
So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media Interview. You know, MrMedia.com, MRMedia.com. Stop by and check it out. There are nearly 700 archived celebrity interviews for your listening pleasure. The show is brought to you today by thepartyauthority.us. Planning a wedding, mitzvah, or corporate event? For any and all occasions, call the Party Authority nationwide at 1-800-DIAL-DJs. That's 1-800-342-5357, where one call does it all. Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience of people who only think they saw the Beatles at Shea Stadium in the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. Howard Sounes won't deny that there have been an awful lot of books about the Beatles and Paul McCartney, but that didn't give him pause. He just researched and wrote one of the best. This massive 634-page biography covers so much time and detail that frankly I wasn't sure I could read all of it in a timely manner and still conduct an interview in this calendar year. So I proposed a compromise. Let's just talk about the second half of the book. Linda Eastman McCartney, the Wings years, the infighting among the ex-Beatles, John Lennon's death, Linda's death, George Harrison's death, his marriage and divorce to Heather Mills, and so on. This part of the book is plenty rich and, I think, a little less known and understood than the Beatles years, which have been examined and analyzed beyond, just beyond. And then this morning, there was big news, big Beatles news, great timing for us, certainly great timing for Howard, that the Beatles have finally released their catalog to iTunes. So you'll be able to download any digital song legally of the Beatles that you want. So, joining me now, live on tape from London, England, is the author of Fab, Howard Sounes. Howard, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you.
So I gotta start with this news about the Beatles and iTunes. Do you think it's a big deal?
Well, I'm one of the few people in the Western world who doesn't have a mobile phone and has never used iTunes, so it means nothing to me, but I'm a dinosaur.
Do you think, as an observer of the Beatles and Paul McCartney, do you think it will be a big deal? I mean, you talk a lot in the book, certainly in the second half of the book, about certain points in McCartney's career where something has happened that has created a surge of interest and a new surge of money, Beatles money. Do you think this will have that kind of effect?
I'm sure it will, but I think when you're Paul McCartney and you've got $600 million in the bank, it's really irrelevant. I mean, he's been a millionaire since he was 25. He's got money to buy everything he wants and more. It becomes a complete abstract concept. The money pours in. It just comes in year after year from all sorts of reissues and DVDs, and every year there's some new gimmick that Apple come up with, and there's just a constant avalanche of money. There's more money than he knows what to do with.
Now, you talk in the book about Anthology when that came out, which was there was video, there was a collection of all the great songs, and there was the number one collection. That brought in a big surge of money that I think, from what I remember reading, that was more intended to help George Harrison and Ringo Starr at that point, not necessarily to catch up to Paul, but to have more money. That they hadn't raked it in like he had over the years. No,
Paul had been one of the principal earners in the Beatles because, of course, he was the co-writer of most of the songs, and Ringo and George weren't ever on that level with John and Paul. And also his post-Beatles career had been by far the most successful, and he had invested very shrewdly with the help of his wife's father and brother, the Eastmans, New York attorneys. He'd invested in song copyrights very successfully, and he bought property, and he'd just been very shrewd. And George Harrison, in contrast, had a patchy solo career, threw his money around on racing cars and movies and silly houses, and wound up not quite broke, but certainly looking for a few bob by the time the Anthology came along.
Do you think the availability of the Beatles catalog on iTunes for, let's say, for Ringo and for the estates of Harrison and Lennon will have a big impact?
Well, I mean, they certainly. No, I think even to them now. I mean, there is so much money. There is so much money flowing through Apple into the Beatles' pockets, into the estates. That I mean, it's always nice to have another $1 million, but if you've already got 100 million plus, which they would all have now, and Paul has many times that. I mean, to me, it seems irrelevant. I mean, you only need a certain amount of money in life. I mean, Paul McCartney's got 14 homes, for instance. I mean, how many homes do you need? It's a full-time job travelling between them. So the iTunes money, I'm sure, is lovely. And you can't, as somebody once said, you can't be too thin, you can't be too rich. But I can't believe that it's a major issue in any of their lives.
Now, having said that, though, from reading the book, I got the sense that Paul was never the spendthrift. That he and Linda, particularly when he was with her, they lived rather modestly. I mean, they had large estates, and they liked to, surround themselves with woods and keep them pristine. But he wasn't someone who spent a lot of money, really, it seemed, until he married Heather Mills.
Yes, I mean, shrewd, I think, is the word.
Yeah.
Of course, the collapse of the Beatles was a financial mess, of course. I mean, he was a very rich man, but the Beatles was mired in all sorts of problems. There were debts to the taxman because of the whole Alan Klein fiasco. And I think that probably hurt him, and he hurt his ego, apart from anything else, that the greatest band in show business had sort of ended up in such a financial mess. And I think he certainly, in the 70s, with Linda's father and brother, he worked very hard to consolidate his affairs and to build an organization that was solid and reliable, and so his income and his fortune would grow. But by the end of the 70s, I mean, he was so fabulously wealthy. I mean, for instance, he's got a farm just outside London. The farm is twice the size of Central Park in New York. And there are 14 homes. There are houses all over the world. He keeps $15,000 in petty cash, as we now know. He's got paintings by Monet and Picasso on the wall. It's a different life to almost everybody. It's a uniquely privileged and rich life.
Well, let me ask you about the book, Howard. I myself have written 10 nonfiction books, usually about 300 pages each, working with business people, but it makes my head ache to think about the amount of work and time you put into Fab.
Well, I mean, of course, the thing about Fab, the thing about a Paul McCartney book is that so much of the story is well known, is familiar, but it's still very important. You have to write the story of the Beatles. You have to address that story, and you have to do it properly. That's why it's such a large book. Half of the book is the Beatles story. That's 300 pages. And then, of course, there's all that's happened afterwards. That's 40 years of life, and that's why it's got to be double that size, 600 pages. And, of course, if you look at it coldly, it seems impossible and impossibly daunting. But the thing is, you just have to get stuck in, and you have to work every day. And I worked every day for 2.5 years or so. And at the end of 2.5 years, you've got a book.
I don't know. You did this in 2.5 years. I feel like a piker next to you, my friend.
Yeah, well, I mean, I write books for a living. I do it full time. I don't do anything else. So it's not as if I've got something else that's, there's no other call on my time. So I work every day. I certainly work hard, and it certainly was difficult. But the difficulty really is trying to tell a familiar story so it's fresh. And the analogy I always say is really Winston Churchill. If one were to write a biography of Winston Churchill, who had a wonderful, interesting life, you'd have to tell the story within that book of the Second World War. Now, that alone would take you 300-400 pages, And then Sir Winston had a whole life before the war and after the war that's really equally as important. And it's a bit like that with Paul. There's the Beatles story, which is huge, but there's a whole lot more besides. And that's quite difficult to actually pull off.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to the story of Paul McCartney's, as you put it, intimate life, and how you went about the business of bringing it all together and finding some fresh material?
Well, I thought that previous books had got the balance wrong of the Beatles and after the Beatles. Most books about Paul are about Paul in the Beatles, and then authors run out of space or time or energy, and they try and rush through the 40 years after the Beatles in about 100 pages, and that seems to me to be a fundamental mistake. So I could redress that by getting the structure right. As to finding new material, I always interview very widely, and I try to get as much original material as I can. And so there is a frantic process for over a year or so of writing to people, phoning people up, traveling around the world, doing interviews. And the more interviews you do, the more you learn, and the more ideas you have, and you build up theories, and you build up sort of leads to new stories, and themes develop. And then hopefully when you sit down, you've got a kind of a fresh take on the subject. So that's really the process.
I think as a writer myself, I was very impressed by the sheer number of original interviews you seem to have conducted for this, because it's different. You know, there are a lot of people who write these books and they throw them together strictly from existing material. They don't do original research. And it seemed like you got a great deal of cooperation from McCartney's friends and extended family. Were many of them looking to settle scores with Paul, or were they looking to set the record straight? You know, they usually, people, when you interview them for a book like this, there's something that they want out of it. What did these people want?
Well, probably different motives. I don't really inquire too closely about people's motives. As long as they're telling me the truth, I don't feel I'm being lied to. I'm quite happy to go along with them. Many people were interviewed, but it's also, I must say, it's fair to say that many people weren't interviewed because they wouldn't. And they wouldn't, I think, because Paul didn't want them to. And so quite a few people who ordinarily would have spoken to me, if I'd been doing another book, let's say, like my book about Bob Dylan, I found that certain avenues were cut off because I felt that he was interfering behind the scenes. So that was a problem. But nevertheless, you mustn't give up. You must be tough. You know, you can't just throw your hands in the air and say, oh, I can't do this. You just have to carry on. Be a bit more imaginative, perhaps. Find different people that haven't been found before, people who are a bit obscure, but nevertheless interesting. And you know, I think it worked, but it wasn't easy.
Yeah, I suspected that you probably did not get cooperation from the estate. From what you just said, I guess that's true. Have you gotten any response? And by I'm sorry, estate is not what I meant to say. That implies that the man is deceased. But McCartney and his company, have you had any response since the book's been available in review?
No, and I wouldn't expect to. I wouldn't expect to hear from him.
I don't know. You know, you reference, I think, a few times in the book where things in the media he has responded to, or things have upset him, or...
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's pretty... yes, well, I mean, I think if he was really outraged or upset, he might say something, but he certainly hasn't to me.
It seems like, I tell people who are thinking about, you know, whether to buy the book or not, it seems like a very even-handed book. I mean, it's a warts and all story, you know. I mean, Paul, like any of us, has his problems and his faults, and you write about them. But I found it to be a very fair presentation of the life of a man who's very public and has made some very public, has done some great things in the public, and has done some, you know, probably some stupid things in the public.
Yes, well, thank you. I hope that is the case. I mean, some people, I think, get the impression that because it's unauthorized and because it is critical in places, that it's a negative book, that it's some kind of character assassination. But that isn't the case at all. I mean, my motives are professional. I'm independent. I mean, I don't I'm not pro Paul McCartney or anti Paul McCartney. I mean, on balance, actually, I admire the man, and I certainly like a great deal of the music. But the point is that what one is trying to do is tell a true story, and a rounded story, to try so that the subject of the biography, Sir Paul, emerges as a real person. And of course, real people are complicated. And somebody as successful and famous as Sir Paul is very complicated. It's a long, rich, it's a long and winding road, his life, more than most people. And so there is good and bad. But it isn't. I'm not in the tradition of Albert Goldman or Kitty Kelly. I'm not trying to reveal Paul McCartney to be a monster. I don't feel that at all. I just feel that he isn't necessarily the simple, smiling guy with the peace sign in a magazine. He's a more complicated man than that. You don't get to be Sir Paul McCartney, probably one of the handful of most famous show business people in the world today, by being a kind of guileless simpleton. I mean, he's far from being that.
Absolutely. Let's take a quick break. This is Bob Andelman, and you're listening to the Mr. Media radio interview with pop music historian Howard Sounes, author of Fab, An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney. And we'll be right back.
This is a public disservice message from the National Lampoon Radio Hour.
Don't waste your evenings doing volunteer work at your local mental hospital. Remember, even if you do, the crazy people there will probably think you didn't.
All right, this is Bob Andelman, and you're listening to the Mr. Media radio interview with pop music historian Howard Sounes, author of Fab, An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney. Howard, is there anything you left out of the book for reasons of space, propriety, or some other reason?
Yes. Yes, there is. We have this thing in Europe now called privacy legislation, which is a new thing that comes from the European Parliament. And really, it's a great hindrance to a biographer or a journalist, because it basically means that legislation means that certain areas of people's lives are no longer apparently fair comment, or they're no longer in the public domain. Now, years ago, this was never the case. No one ever worried about privacy with public figures. If you're a public figure, it was taken for granted that you could be discussed in all aspects of your life. But there is this creeping legislation in Europe, and this book that is published in the States is also published all over the world and was originated in Europe. And so, as a result, there were things that I would like to have been in the book about family matters, let's say, that lawyers took out because they said, Howard, don't forget privacy. And that, frankly, that drives me crackers, because I think it's crazy legislation.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. I know over here the British press has kind of a reputation for going overboard with people's lives, and not to say that the American press has not, with TMZ and all that kind of thing. But I guess I wasn't terribly surprised by that legislation.
I'm rather dumbfounded by it. I mean, it's getting worse and worse, and it's been happening over the past few years, and I'm not quite sure where it's going to end. But the effect of it is that it muzzles journalism, and it muzzles biography, because of course biography, by its the whole point of biography is to tell the life of a human being, a real person, and if they're alive. I mean, even if they're dead, you've got a problem, because, of course, there are many more people in the biography than the subject. There are all his family and friends and associates, and any of them can start complaining these days about privacy. You're invading my privacy, which to me seems like nonsense. And it's it's a weasel. These are weasel words. It's a way of hiding the truth often. So. That is a problem, I think, for people like myself.
Now, with regard to Heather Mills, you certainly got in an awful lot of material about her, but I guess that was thanks to court documents.
Yes, it was primarily. Very, very unusually, most divorces are held in private in the UK, and the judge in the McCartney-Mills divorce, he decided to publish the judgment, which is a remarkable document, very long, very detailed, includes all sorts of detail, not only about the marriage, but about Paul's life, his fortune, his businesses, and his property interests, and his security, and all sorts of things. And that's a fascinating amount of information for a biographer. And of course, although some of it's been, or much of it has been in the press, it's a different thing to take it and shape it into a book, because of course you have more space in a book and you can explore the nuances. And I'm sure there are quite a few details in the judgment that are in the book that people would have not quite understood the full importance of. And Heather Mills is revealed by the facts for what she is, really. I mean, I quite admire her in a way, but I'm sure she's not widely liked.
She's a gift to biographers, isn't she?
Well, yes, she is. She's a great character. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, as a biographer, you want interesting people to write about, and she's a very interesting woman and a very strong character, actually.
Hmm. Let me ask you about the three primary women in Paul McCartney's life, excluding his children. I tend not to want to talk about children, but his mother, his much beloved mother, who could bring him to tears just the thought of or conversation with her. His first wife, Linda McCartney, and his second, Heather Mills McCartney. Can you point to any characteristics that perhaps they all shared? Is there a commonality there?
Well, I'd have a different selection. I mean, I'd leave the mother out of it. Mother died when he was 14, and
right.
He's very sentimental about his mother. But apart from the mother, the three key women in his life are his Beatles girlfriend, Jane Asher, Linda, and Heather, the second wife. Mm-hmm. And I think they do have a common. They do have things in common. Principally, they are, although very different, they are all very strong characters, very strong personalities. And I think, and the Beatles have tended to marry strong women. I say in the book, I just said a few minutes ago that I didn't see Paul as a monster, but in a sense he is a monster. The Beatles are monsters. In the sense, what I mean is they're so rich and famous and powerful that inevitably they're rather daunting. They are rather monstrous. They are larger than life. And most people are rather scared of them and rather wary of them in business, let's say. And in the music business. And I think only the very strongest personalities, people like Heather Mills and Linda McCartney, are able to cut through that nonsense and actually sort of make a contact with somebody so imposing. And of course, Yoko's a very strong character. George's wife, Olivia, they're all strong women.
Well, before we run out of time, I have to ask you about Wings, Paul's post-Beatles band, for those of you born after 1980. Do they deserve more respect than they get, and do you think that they ever will get more respect?
No, I mean, I think really they're rather overrated. I mean, they're more popular. They've always been more popular in the States than in the UK, mm-hmm. And they did very well in the 70s. I think it fitted in with the times, really. Had lots of FM hits, didn't they, in the 70s?
Oh, sure.
They didn't in the UK, where they were always viewed with much more suspicion. I think there are some good songs there, and certainly there's enough tracks to make a greatest hits album or to liven up a concert. But if you listen to all of those albums back to back and you listen to them with some critical judgment, there's an awful lot of mediocre material there.
Hmm. Interesting. But I have to say, having listened to a lot of John Lennon's solo material, there was a lot of mediocre material there too. I mean, it's an interesting, to me anyway, it's interesting to me that these two really were halves to a whole. Put them together, amazing things happen. On their own, a little more hit and miss, a little more of the chemistry that's common to other musicians, where they might go a longer time without a hit. Yes,
certainly they were both stronger in the band, and certainly there's a falling off in quality with both of them, with all of them, with all the Beatles. There's a falling off in quality after the Beatles, but of course they keep making music, and Paul has worked hard to maintain a career independent of the Beatles. And so he keeps putting records out. And if he does that, you have to listen to them and make a judgment about them. And they shouldn't just be given a free pass because, he was so great in the Beatles, therefore everything he did is great. That's just not the case. There is some good work, some overlooked albums, I think. but there's an awful lot of mediocre stuff as well.
For myself, I was glad to see you mention Run Devil Run. I thought that was very good. I really liked that one.
Yeah, I like Memory Almost Full and Flaming Pie, and the second Fireman album, Rushes. I mean, there's plenty of good albums, but there's some pretty rotten albums like Venus and Mars and Press to Play and Wildlife, and even the very best albums like Ram and Band on the Run. I don't really think they're solid gold classics. They're not all-time classics like Abbey Road or the White Album. They're not quite as good as that. In fact, they're not nearly as good as that, to be honest.
Well, we've about run out of time, and folks, I want to let you know you can find biographer Howard Sounes' new book, Fab, An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney, at great bookstores everywhere, United States and around the world, or order it right now at a great price at mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. So does a guy who does not carry a mobile phone use Facebook or Twitter? Can people find you in those places?
No, you've got to be joking. I've got a website, but if people want a website, but books are the thing, aren't they? Buy a book, read it in bed, curl up with your loved one and read a book. I mean, all this Twitter stuff makes me want to puke.
Well, now I know how you had enough free time to do a book like this in 2.5 years. No mobile phone interruptions, no Twitter, and no Facebook.
And I still play vinyl records.
Oh, you're a scary dude, Howard.
Yeah, I'm still. I live in the past. Well, I live in England. You know, we're about 20 years behind the rest of you people.
Well, listen, Howard Sounes, thank you so much for joining us on Mr. Media today. And folks, for more original interviews with your favorite musicians and music journalists, you can surf over to our main website, mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. And subscribe to Mr. Media on iTunes, and you'll never miss a show. Just search Mr. Media Interviews from within iTunes and subscribe for free. If you've got an idea for a guest, a comment on today's show, or would like to advertise on Mr. Media Radio, email me directly at bob@mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. You can also follow me, maybe not Howard, but you can follow me on Facebook or on Twitter, twitter.com/Andelman, or on Facebook, just search Mr. Media Interviews. Thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you sharing a piece of your day with Mr. Media. Thanks for listening.